We welcome you back to this channel. In this video, we present horror stories from Reddit. These stories, shared by real users, immerse us in supernatural experiences, unsettling encounters, and unsolved mysteries. Go ahead, turn off the lights, and let's take one more step into the world of the unknown.
The empty room.
Some time ago, when I was at one of my first jobs, I rented a room in a shared apartment in an old building in the city center. The stone and mosaic facade, dirty with smog, gave it an ancient air. The building's maintenance was mediocre. The stone stairs still bore the scars of a fire that had occurred decades ago, according to the older neighbors. The apartment had 3 rooms and was on the 4th floor. It had a living room, dining room, kitchen, and a small balcony. One of the rooms faced outside, while the other 2 faced the interior, towards the stairs and the central patio, similar to a tenement. The wooden floors were old and somewhat deformed due to humidity. Since I moved in, strange noises could be heard, as if something small was walking around. I thought it was rats or simply the creaking of an old building. Of the 3 roommates, the youngest moved out after a few months, leaving his room empty. David, the other roommate, had also just moved into the same apartment and was 2 years older than me. He was good-humored and worked in photography. He didn't like his room, the one that faced outside. He said it felt strange and got very cold. He also mentioned that the window would open by itself when he wasn't there. We joked about his paranoia, but he insisted something was wrong. David moved to the empty interior room, leaving his old room with just a plastic chair. During the December holidays, David traveled, and I stayed alone in the apartment. One night, while watching TV, I heard a rhythmic noise, like distant footsteps. I turned down the volume and listened. The sound came from David's room. I slowly approached the closed door, but there was no one there, just the open window. I closed it, turned off the light, and went back to the living room. Everything was quiet for the rest of the night. The next day, while making a sandwich in the kitchen, the noise started again. I cautiously approached the room. The footsteps were unmistakable. I opened the door with a knife in hand, but there was nothing and no one. The window, however, was open again. I decided to leave the light on and the door open, watching the room while I ate. Later, sitting in the plastic chair in the room, trying to figure out what was happening, the window suddenly opened. I looked outside, but there was no way anyone could climb up there. As I pondered this, I heard the footsteps behind me again. I turned quickly and saw it. The plastic chair moving slightly due to the draft on the uneven floor, making the sound of footsteps. The old window with a defective spring would open by itself. That was my paranormal experience. Weeks later, I asked the landlord about David, since he hadn't returned. To my surprise, the landlord told me he didn't know anyone named David and had never rented a room to someone by that name.
The man with the claw.
This is my story. It happened when I was little. My siblings and I were home alone. Our parents had gone to visit an aunt, and we decided to play to pass the time. Suddenly, we heard a sinister laugh slowly approaching and then footsteps coming from upstairs. The house was large and old, with wooden floors that creaked. That night, the creaks were more intense. We looked at each other, trying to figure out if someone was joking, but we all had the same expression of fear. We decided to investigate, and I was the first to go up. My siblings followed me closely. As we climbed the stairs, the laughter became clearer and the footsteps heavier. When we reached the upper floor, I noticed that the storage room door was ajar, letting in a faint light. With courage, I pushed the door open. What I saw left me frozen. A very tall man with a sharp claw in one hand and a knife in the other. His eyes were 2 dark pits, and his face was deformed. The most terrifying thing was his fingers, or rather, the lack of them. He had 2 fingers cut off. The man slowly turned around upon sensing my presence. When his eyes met mine, I felt a chill. The laughter turned into a low, guttural growl. I ran as fast as I could to the bathroom, dragging my siblings with me. We slammed the door shut and huddled on the floor, trembling with fear. The man started banging on the door forcefully. My older siblings noticed a small window at the top of the bathroom wall. One by one, they began to climb out of the window, painfully and with difficulty. The window led outside the house, and once we were out, we started running without looking back. We got scratched and hurt, but we just wanted to get away from that creature. We ran to the house of a neighbor who had always been kind to us. She quickly let us in and called our parents. We were trembling and sobbing, trying to explain what had happened. Our parents arrived quickly, very worried. That was the last time we went back to that house. My parents decided we would move. Even today, years later, when I remember that night, I feel a chill. I will never forget the figure of the man with the claw and the cut-off fingers. Sometimes I wonder who or what he was, and if he's still there, waiting for someone else to dare to climb the stairs.
The old woman in the hallway.
Several years ago, I lived near a hospital that had been abandoned due to flooding. This place, located in a city I won't name, became an ideal spot for urban explorers and thrill seekers. I had a friend, John, who was very fearful of the paranormal. Determined to overcome his fears, he accepted my proposal to explore the hospital at night during New Year's to face his fears. We began our explorations in the afternoon to familiarize ourselves with the place in daylight and then navigate it with flashlights at night. For a week, we followed an established route, walking through the corridors and ruined rooms. Gradually, John started to feel more comfortable. One night, we decided to explore rooms outside our usual route. We found abandoned files and spent some time browsing through them without discovering anything of interest. As we headed back to the main entrance, I started to feel like I was walking alone. When I turned around, I saw that John and our friends had stayed behind, huddling together, visibly scared. I turned my head to the front to see what had frightened them and saw an old woman standing at the entrance with an umbrella open inside the hospital, looking at the floor. Her white hair was tied in a tight bun with some loose strands falling over her wrinkled forehead. She wore a long, worn-out black dress that barely touched the floor and almost disintegrating old shoes. Her pale skin was marked with age spots, and her hands, firmly holding the umbrella, trembled slightly. She looked at me and we locked eyes for a moment. Her gray, almost clouded eyes had something in them that made me shiver. I responded with a smile and said, "Good afternoon." She returned my greeting with a calm and raspy voice. I walked past her and exited the hospital. My friends, however, ran out without saying a word to her. Once outside, I scolded them, telling them never to be rude to a ghost. Wanting to verify if it was really a ghost or just another person exploring like us, they convinced me to go back into the hospital. When we returned to the entrance, the old woman was gone. There was no trace of her. To this day, I still think she might have been just another person exploring like us. However, I can't deny that it was strange to find an old woman in such a place, and even stranger that she disappeared so quickly. The only possible exit was where we had been standing, making it unlikely that someone of her age could have jumped the fence to get out another way. That encounter left me with more questions than answers. Although I try to convince myself it was just a coincidence, there is something inside me that can't stop thinking about the possibility that we really had an encounter with the unknown.
Memories of Grandma's house.
The story I'm about to tell might seem insignificant, but since I am very fearful, anything scares me. This happened many years ago at my grandmother's house, a place where strange things always occurred. Once, while I was in the bathroom, someone knocked on the door forcefully. "Who is it?" I asked in a trembling voice. There was no response. When I came out, I asked my grandmother if it had been her, but she always denied knocking on the door. On another occasion, while I was in the bathroom again, the sound of knocking on the door startled me once more. "Who is it?" I repeated, more scared this time. I opened the door slowly, expecting to find someone, but the hallway was empty. My grandmother, sitting in her rocking chair, looked at me strangely when I asked her if she had knocked on the door. "It wasn't me," she replied. My brother's toys also fell off the shelves by themselves, despite being heavy and there being no wind to move them. One night, while I was playing with my brother in the living room, one of his toys, a rather heavy metal car, slid off the table and fell to the floor. There was no one else in the house, and there was no wind. I looked at my brother, and his face reflected the same fear I felt. One night, after struggling for hours to fall asleep, I felt a tug on the sheet. It was a gentle tug at first, but it became more insistent. I held onto the sheet with all my strength, but then I felt the mattress sink as if someone had sat on the edge of the bed. I couldn't move. Fear paralyzed me. I closed my eyes tightly, hoping it would all end. The next morning, during breakfast, my uncle casually mentioned that he had had a restless night. "I felt someone sit on my bed," he said, describing exactly what had happened to me. We looked at each other, sharing a silent understanding that something strange was happening in that house. My grandmother seemed used to it, never showing fear. "This house is old," she would say. But I knew it wasn't just the age of the house. There was something more, something I couldn't see. But it was always there, watching us, touching us, reminding us that we were not alone. Sometimes, when I visit my grandmother, those memories come back strongly. The house remains the same, with its ancient air and its mysteries intact. Every time an object falls or I hear an inexplicable noise, I am overwhelmed by the same feeling of being watched. Now at least I know I am not alone in my fear. Others have felt the same, but that doesn't make the feeling any less terrifying.
The lady with the dark eyes.
Several years ago, on a night that seemed ordinary, my friends and I were heading to drop one of them off at his house after a gathering. We were headed towards a neighborhood known for its tranquility, near the river. It was around 11:30 at night, and the road was practically deserted, enveloped in an unsettling silence, broken only by the noise of our car. After dropping off our friend, my companion and I began the return trip to the main avenue. Driving alongside the river, my eyes caught sight of a figure slowly moving along the edge of the road. It was an old lady, walking with a disconcerting slowness, as if time had no meaning for her. I decided to switch to the opposite lane to avoid a potential accident. As we passed her, I slowed down and felt a chill run down my spine. Without any apparent reason, the lady suddenly appeared next to the passenger side. My hands began to sweat, and I slammed on the brakes, stopping the car abruptly. My friend and I turned our heads in unison to see what was happening. What we saw was something I will never forget. The lady had gotten so close to the window that I could see the glass fogging up with each breath. She was thin and hunched over, dressed in a long, worn-out gray dress that seemed to be from another era. Her hair, a tangle of dirty white strands, fell messily over her shoulders. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, with deep wrinkles that told stories of a long and difficult life. But the most terrifying thing was her eyes, or rather the lack of them. Instead of eyes, there were only two voids of darkness. She didn't move. She just stared at us with that inhuman emptiness that chilled our blood. The sensation of her gaze was almost physical, a pressure that seemed to pierce our souls. Panic seized us. We started screaming, and without a second thought, I hit the gas. The car roared as we sped away, leaving that terrifying vision behind. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, my heart skipped a beat. The lady was back on the other side of the street, at the same spot where she had started to cross. We never spoke about that night again. Something in us changed forever. We never again dropped our friend off at his house. Since then, every time I pass by that avenue, I speed up a bit, hoping never to encounter that empty gaze again.
Thank you for journeying with us through the dark passages of these stories. If you enjoyed them, give us a like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss more tales of terror. Until next time, where fear will once again be your companion.